Terje Osmundsen, thank you so much for joining the NABA Perspectives podcast. Real pleasure to have you on.
Good morning, Rolando. Pleasure on my side as well.
Now, we're going to be talking about Africa, its changing role in world affairs, what it means for doing business on the continent. But before we do so, just by way of a quick introduction, tell us a little bit about your work, how it relates to Africa, and why this is a topic that is of particular interest to you.
Yes, I would like to say that my passion for working on the Africa renewable energy scene started actually in my time at Scatec, when after the Copenhagen summit with all the setbacks, I was really had the privilege to have the chance to work for 8 years in Scatec, pioneering solar in Africa, and now in Empower New Energy, which we have set up some years back. We're now focusing particularly on investing in Africa with solar and battery and hybrid solutions, empowering communities and businesses. And so my passion is to see that in a country, in a continent, Africa, where the needs are, the market is so big, the needs are so enormous, that relatively smaller investment can really make a difference. So that is my and then, of course, having traveled a lot to Africa the last 15 years, I have, of course, also personally and you could say intellectually become more and more engaged in the debate of what we in Norway and also the rest of the world should do to promote, to deepen our partnership with Africa. So I think that is probably the short answer to your question.
Excellent, thank you. Well, a lot has changed in the last 15 years, and that change is accelerating. And that's where we pick up the conversation here. You recently posted an opinion piece in the Norwegian press where you make the point that what Africa needs is more investment, not more empty promises, essentially. And I want to start with a line from the article that you published, which I think really cuts to the heart of the matter. And you write that the Western world is struggling to come to terms with new realities in Africa. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that, first of all, is that African leaders are now continuously have become much more impatient and demanding, and are expecting different things to discuss than what they normally will be served when Western leaders are meeting them. Or at least that has been the case up to very recently. When you look at that, of course, Africa is very varied and the challenges are different, but there is a main trend, which is the pressure that leaders in Africa are under from a growing population, especially a growing youth population, educated people, and they are now more and more being more and more vocal on the streets, in the social media, everywhere, demanding jobs, demanding growth, demanding higher living standards. And what we are delivering very often is political speeches about values and cooperation, but we are not delivering on what these countries are looking for, which is real investments on the ground that change the life for millions of people, and that's what they're looking for.
Yes, and
And
especially
part of
young
that,
people.
especially young people, and part of that also is the new geopolitical, the whole new geopolitical situation where Russia in particular now are seeking to leverage this growing disappointment with the history, and are now in country by country being present with military agreements and unfortunately also anti-democratic disinformation campaigns and other things. So Africa has really become a kind of also an arena for a new type of competition, not on investments. I wouldn't. I mean, we tend often in the West to look at it, China investment versus where. That's not the main issue. I think the main issue is to see that there is a lot of activity now in Africa. We're actually undermining the legitimacy of the existing governing structures, and that is also a challenge for Africa right now that we should be aware of.
And when you say the West is struggling to come to terms with these realities, where do you see the gaps in understanding and knowledge here?
Well, first of all, I see the gaps in. You take one example, of course. You can say that there's a lot of Western funding organization who has taken the very correct, politically correct decision to not finance anything related to fossil fuel. And I'm a passionate about renewable energy, but I think it's ridiculous to give African nations the impression that whatever they do to promote natural gas, for instance, is contrary to world global interest. So that is an example of the kind of decisions or position that Western governments make that is actually alienating governments in Africa. But more fundamentally, what I see is that the lack of, how should I put it? It is we are forcing, especially I would say the US, and fortunately not Europe is not there yet, but especially the US is trying to give the pic or to convey a message, a narrative that the African governments need to choose between the West and the East, and that is completely a view of the reality which is deep bad. What African people is looking for is, as I said, solutions, investments, progress, and whether that progress comes from the East or the West, it doesn't matter. That's what they're looking for. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I can't argue with that point. Now, you mentioned the US. Now, one of the trends we are seeing, now there may be gaps in understanding how the realities are shaping the continent. There's a lot of rhetoric now coming out of Western nations about how we need to partner more with Africa. We need to revamp our strategies with Africa. And we've seen new strategies being launched. The US as well has sort of been pushing the story of, we're now going to take the continent more seriously. We're seeing it in Europe. What do you make of this trend of what you're seeing in terms of the activities? Are they getting it right? Where do you see maybe examples of where we're heading in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, what you see, for instance, in the US is that they have this great trade initiative with African countries, but then you see this, I would say, very negative or ridiculous efforts by politicians in Washington, senators, and so on, trying to link the voting of African nations in the UN to what kind of economic relationship you have. If we are not able, from our side, to recognize that the double standards we have been pursuing, the West has, especially the US, but partly supported by the rest of the West, has a couple of occasions. We can name the Iraq war. We can also maybe also mention what happened in Libya. We have several times made actions against international law, and now we are forcing or challenging the African nations to follow our thinking in terms of what's happening in Ukraine. Of course, African nations, they see also what's happening in Gaza. So I'm not at all, how to put it this way, I'm very disappointed that it has not been more a stronger reaction in Africa against Russia's actions in Ukraine. But I think we also need to listen to what they say when they say that, yes, we understand this is serious, but we also have other issues, like in Gaza, where you're also violating international law. And I think that's the reality. So that's an example of the kind, but I don't think that is the key. I think that is something which we will evolve. I think the main issue is that the capital markets in the West is very short-sighted and is driven by a logic which probably put too much. I would say is looking at Africa as too risky. We see big Western companies now retreating from Africa, and what is happening is that Turkish and Singapore, Asian and China companies are stepping in. That's not necessarily bad for Africa, but of course, if we want to be looked at as a long-term partner, it is certainly a negative thing that Western companies are retreating from Africa and not investing.
Absolutely. And you touch on the point around, it's not just China, it's not just Russia. We're seeing a lot of engagement coming from other parts of the world. The Gulf states in recent years have very significantly ramped up their investments in the continent. You look at a place like India, even places like Japan, there's a real push to get more private capital to the continent. Now, on the surface, when you look at that, you think, well, I mean, what's wrong with this? We all understand one of the most fundamental rules of the market is competition is desirable, and competition can be good for business. And Africa now has an array of partners to choose from. Now, what I'm getting at with this is, how does the West compete in this landscape? It seems to me that, you're saying that enough of the moralizing. What we need to do is provide good reasons to work with us, rather
Exactly.
than picking say Turkey or the Gulf states over working with Norway or the US.
Hmm. No, I think let's take a parallel to the Marshall aid after the Second World War. I mean, what the U.S. then, they had this enlightened understanding that if they were able to mobilize with grants and subsidized loans, massive reconstruction of Europe would move towards a kind of a democratic liberal model that would be also in the long-term interest of the United States. And I think what we see now is that there's nothing wrong with Turkish and Emirate investors in Africa, not at all. But if we want that the African countries, which is, I mean, we're talking about a continent that will have more than every fourth person in the earth in 25 years will be in Africa. And if you want that these countries to also to be oriented and have deep relations with the West, it is in our interest to make a long-term view, saying that okay, the prosperity and growth in these countries is also going to benefit us, just like the Americans concluded after the Second World War. And it's not a question of forcing them to choose. It's more a question of, and we could come back to what opportunities Norway could play, but I see many areas where Norway's business from Norway could actually play such a role if it was in a partnership also with the Norwegian government.
Okay, well, let's move to Norway and let's talk more about the picture when it comes to investment from Norway. Now, this debate, of course, is also taking place in Norway, around understanding how the realities of Africa are changing. How do we respond to that? Do we have a plan? Now, before we get into that, a couple of figures from the article that you published to set the scene. In 2022, Norwegian companies invested only $600 million across Africa. So that's 54 markets, very big place, very diverse place. And that's less than 2.5% of total Norwegian external investment. How do you explain such a low figure?
No, it's first of all, and I must say that it's actually also very striking that most of those investments are in renewable energy, right? It's Scatec and a few others like ours and a few others, and there are some other sectors, but they are very small. What happened the decade before was that Norway had Statoil at that time, Norway Equinor, who was investing heavily in Africa, and there were a few other companies. They have retreated, from the African continent. So actually, the amount of foreign direct investment from Norway to Africa is now only 10 to 20% of what it used to be for many years, which is really striking. And the trade also is very low, very marginal. So that is, and I think the reason for this is that for most of the other sectors, I mean, if you can look at also where the state is, we have the government has the Norwegian Petroleum Fund, we have Telenor, we have Equinor, Statkraft, and all these companies where the government is either 100% or a controlling owner. They are not investing in Africa. For some of them, it's actually a policy not to invest in Africa. For other companies, it's just a decision not to do it. Of course, there is a reason for this. The risks are real. We've just taken an example, of course, the currency turbulence that we've seen with the depreciations of currencies and financial instability in many countries. Of course, that is real. So we should not kid ourselves to say that this is simple. But I think we need then to ask, and that's why I think we should discuss, to say, okay, what can the Norwegian government and industry do together in terms of finding ways to cooperate? What kind of ways to kind of make, kind of share that risk, which is related to important sustainable investments in Africa? Because I'm convinced that when a Norwegian company invests in, say, be it metal processing or mineral research mining, or be it aquaculture, or be it infrastructure, they bring a set of values and approach to doing business, which we see in Empone Energy is very well received, and I think we also other companies will see that. So it has an impact, and there are benefits from working with the Norwegian companies in terms of know-how and so on. But I think we need to recognize that if we just continue like now, it's going to be very marginal. So we need to do something.
Yeah, before we get to what to do about it, I just want to underline the point you made that we're not here sugarcoating the conversation. Africa is a complex market. There are risks. It can, depending on where you're investing, it can be a very difficult market to navigate. I guess the point here is more about understanding that realities globally are creating an environment in where it's not just a question of do you want to invest in Africa, it's also understanding the importance of cooperating and engaging with these economies. Now, and that to me seems like it's an issue of one, understanding, and two, of strategy. You touched on the issue of what the policy aspect is when it comes to Norwegian investment to Africa and the role of the state in this. When we look at countries like Russia, like China, even Turkey, you look at the Emiratis, they have a very strong sort of focused, often state-led approach to it, which enables their businesses, their companies to take on that kind of risk. Is that along the lines that you're thinking when we look at Norway? What would your checklist be of things that need to be addressed?
Yes. So first of all, I think most importantly is to agree on the challenge, and that is what I miss. That is what I still find missing in the strategy. That it should be a kind of alarm, almost an alarm signal in the strategy that the investment level is that low. I mean, why is that not the main focus in a way that we are been declining? So you have to start with that reality check, right? And then you have to ask within our economic model, which is not China's or Russia's, what can be done, which is the interest of our society and the global society and the companies. And then if you take an example like Denmark and Singapore, those are two countries which I think are comparable to Norway, and they are playing quite an active role in working with the companies to also with various means, but also by financial means, seeing how they can risk mitigate or support financially certain type of investments in those countries. In Norway, Norfund is doing a great job as a partner, but of course Norfund can only be a minority investor, so you have to have an industrial company to actually take the lead. So I would say that one aspect of what could be done could be that we, like the Denmark is looking into, is to see whether it's possible to actually have some kind of risk mitigation in terms of reducing the cost of capital for entering into new ventures, and link that, of course, to certain important targets. If you take, for instance, as I said, decarbonization is one area where Norwegian companies are in lead. It's not only renewable energy, which is important. It could also be that in infrastructure and transport, in metal processing, that Norwegian companies could actually, if they had as a strategy, could invest in these countries, in certain African countries, and showing, demonstrating results in decarbonizing operations, and thereby creating both social and economic and environmental benefits. And for those kind of investments, you could imagine that there was some kind of guarantee mechanism which could be extended to or some kind of I would say soft loans that could be applied to make for a period to make those type of investments possible. Another area, of course, is the area of carbon finance and the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So what we do know is that all over Africa, countries are looking for partners to within the framework of, a bit technical, but in the Paris Agreement, you have Article 6, which opens up for cooperation agreements between countries. Norway has very startup, and it's not meant. It's interesting. It's not even mentioned in the strategy, but it has started in with Morocco and Senegal, I believe. But it could be, and Sweden, for instance, has done a lot more in this area. You could imagine that Norway enters into bilateral arrangements with countries where we actually, through our carbon or climate finance arrangements, work directly with these countries and bring business into decarbonize operations. That would help us to meet our climate targets, and it will certainly also help the countries involved. So I think what I'd like to say here is that the most important is to understand that this is not something that will happen by itself. You need a type of risk-sharing partnership, and how that partnership is designed can be, there are many ways to do it, but I think you need to put a carrot in front of the big companies like, they're all the Norwegian companies who are strong in the various sectors. They need to see a carrot saying, okay, if we succeed here, it'll be good for a long-term business, but in the meantime, the scaling up, the first investments will be de-risked by this partnership. And I think that is the kind of solution I'm looking for.
Now, you've picked out or highlighted the opportunities in the energy sector, both renewables, also decarbonization. A big part of the question that needs to be clarified, of course, is, well, what do you invest in? Energy clearly makes a lot of sense from a Norwegian standpoint. Do you see other sectors or industries on the continent where there really ought to be a little bit more effort to get Norwegian companies involved?
Absolutely. I mean, if you take, for instance, now transport, we're making great progress in Norway on transportation infrastructure, for instance, right? There are companies involved in various parts of the value chain of transportation, linked to electrification or linked to better use of resources or more environmentally or highly efficient infrastructure design. So there are companies, that is one area where countries are looking for, where most African countries are looking for solutions. Just to give an example, I saw that the French company, together with the French government, is working with the region of Lagos to electrify lots of the local ferry transportation, for instance, with a plan. I mean, these are the kind of initiatives that you could imagine. Another, of course, area is aquaculture, where there is a huge, of course, experience in Norway and a huge need in market in Africa, where you could also mention, of course, the whole fintech technology area where there was, and then I will not least mention the whole area of metal processing and minerals, of course, which is high on agenda in Norway now with the battery. We are part, as we see, and we want to play an active role as a country, and also in securing, you could say, Western autonomy in the area of batteries. Of course, there you could also see Norwegian companies partnering with African partners to secure critical minerals for that sector. So yes, I see many areas where I think it's more. I think there's more a question of, if you look at, from a business perspective, you see where's the future markets, and this is one area, right? So and a key area. So yes, there are barriers, there are risks, but if we can find a way to openly address those risks and find a way to share it, I think the things can change.
Now, one thing that's difficult to quantify is just how interested the private sector is. How interested are business leaders in Norway? You are a member of that community. When you talk to your peers, when you talk to your colleagues, what's your sense of where the sentiment is? Is there more appetite maybe that could be tapped into here? Or is it just a case of, well, we're just not interested in it?
No, I think we are at the, could say, a transition point now, because there has been, I think there is in significant sectors of Norwegian business, there has been, first of all, now in a huge drag or a magnet of investments going into the oil and gas sector the last couple of years, and we see that's going to take a lot of resources from Norwegian businesses. And we also see that, of course, There has been, following maybe the financial, the COVID and the Ukraine war and so on, there is a mobilization of resources and around a number of other priorities which had to do with defense and others. So I think right now, I'm afraid I don't have the impression that Africa is high on the agenda in as a general point. But what I also see is that when you dig into more in discussions with business leaders, they recognize that we need, where's the growth coming? Where's the growth? We cannot assume that the growth is going to continue to come from the European markets. We see that there is a overcapacity in some sectors now building up. So I think that it very much depends on what time perspective you put. But the main concern I think people have is a very, I would say, superficial view of Africa being too much risk. Of course, there are risks, but there is a lack of, understanding maybe of the difference between the countries. Investing in the countries like Morocco is completely different than investing in Zimbabwe. Investing in Kenya, of course, is completely different from Somalia. And getting a better understanding of the nuances and the variations here is very important. And I think it's good to look at what's happening to, as I said, Singaporean companies and companies now from Denmark expanding in several sectors. There are, of course, several European, even if European investment have stagnated, there are still some good examples of European companies growing. So I think just studying the peers and see what they're doing is an extremely interesting exercise. And I would really like to, I mentioned Singapore a couple of times, but I think it's a very interesting exercise to see how the big sector of the businesses in Singapore, promoted and incentivized by the government, has been able the last couple of years to take a lead, take a quite important role, and they invest now, I think, almost 10 times or at least 6-7 times more than Norway per year on this sector. Yeah.
Well, I think there's an important point here, which is, if you might not be interested in Africa, but you have to ask yourself the question, why are all these other countries so interested in this part of the world? Are they all getting it wrong, or maybe you're missing a piece of the picture here? And I think that's a question that people don't necessarily have a ready answer for often. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about the Norway's Africa strategy. You've referenced it a couple of times. Just a couple of weeks ago, the government launched a new strategy, and in your article, you say that the new strategy is at risk of being becoming a flash in the pan. What is your concern about the strategy and its impact on driving investment?
No, my concern, as I said, is that we fail to address the key issue, which is how to unlock private sector investments. And if the strategy does not start with a reality check saying that we are at a dramatic low when it comes to investments, and it's actually been, and we need to address that because that is the key success factor for our strategy, then Norway will gradually become more and more marginalized. We maybe be interesting for some NGOs and some general discussion points, but we will not be an attractive partner to discuss how these countries are going to transition from low income, or fossil fuel based low income and fast growing population economies to the future that they're striving for. If we are not seen as a partner in that dialogue, of course, we or that discussion, we will be marginalized. Of course, what we do in some sectors are very important, particularly in the renewable energy field and what Norfund is doing and others. But it's still lacking it's still striking to see how little of Norwegian businesses actually have presence at all. So the risk is that if the strategy does not address that and cannot, does not address with some maybe incentives and proposals to actually address the issue, I'm afraid we will end up as a quite a less important player on the African continent.
There's a lot to unpack there. Unfortunately, we are all but out of time, so we have to wrap up. As a final sort of takeaway, what would your call to action be to the Norwegian policymakers and to Norwegian businesses when it comes to Africa right now and for the next few years or so?
Yeah, no, my call for action would be within your business, within your political organization. Ask yourself, look towards 10 years ahead, and ask yourself, how will the world look like at that point? Where is the most of the people going to come from, and where is the growth? And then ask yourself, what is actually our position in that play. I think that would be the exercise I would recommend everybody to do in that respect.
Right, excellent. We will have to leave it there. This is such an important conversation. Terje Osmundsen, thank you so much for your perspectives this morning.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.